Another major issue of discussion and reform during the 1800s was the issue of slavery and how slavery existed in the United States leading up to the Civil War. So that word antebellum means, in this instance, pre-Civil War. So ante means before and bell means war. So again, before the war. Under slavery, there were two different types of slaves. The first is going to be your rural slavery, and that's going to apply to areas that are in the country. So these are going to be slaves who are going to mostly work on plantations with a lot of slaves, so a very large number of slaves on a plantation, where they would all work mostly probably in field work under the direction of an overseer, somebody who was not the owner more than likely, because the owner is probably very wealthy if they can afford all these slaves. That very backbreaking field work, basically from sunup to sundown. It was not a task system. Slavery before this, and sometimes was a task system where they were given a list of tasks to complete, and once they did, they were finished for the day. But this was not that way. This slavery at this point in time was basically sunup to sundown. You also had house workers. These would have been slaves who took care of children, who cooked and cleaned and took care of any kind of household matters that needed to be taken care of. So these are the types of jobs that, if you lived in a rural community, those are the jobs that slaves would have. Your house workers would have very little contact with your field workers, so they were kind of kept separate in a lot of ways. But again, very difficult life. All lives of slaves were very difficult, but most definitely worse conditions in a rural setting compared to maybe your urban slavery. Now, urban slavery would have been more based on skilled labor, meaning they had a skill that they worked and the owner would hire them out. So again, they might work in a shipyard and the slave would travel to and from their job on a daily basis, and then their wages would go to the slave owner as opposed to the slave. Now, in some cases, the slave owner did allow them to keep a portion of those wages, but more than likely they did not. They did have more freedoms in the North and in an urban setting compared to the South, just because of that idea of them having to travel, to and from that job site on a regular basis. So that's going to be part of this as well. Now, abolitionists, remember, are those who are going to oppose slavery and be against it. And we're going to see several major leaders come out of this movement. The first is William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison had an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, and he is a white abolitionist who believed in the immediate emancipation of slaves without any payment to the slave owner, because there were ideas at this time about how to get rid of slavery, and this is his particular version, was to get rid of slaves immediately, and that those owners who own them should not be given any kind of money as repayment for those slaves that they owned, because he believed slavery was just wrong. The next is David Walker. Now, David Walker is going to be a little different and more radical in that he believed that since you should not own slaves, that slaves should have the right to take that freedom by force. So basically, just to rebel or revolt to get their freedom. So much more radical compared to maybe William Lloyd Garrison or even Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass has his own abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. And in this newspaper, he is going to talk about his particular circumstance. He was a former slave who escaped to the North. And he becomes a major speaker and writer for the abolitionist cause. In fact, he was so good that people didn't believe he could have ever possibly have been a slave. But he writes a book an autobiography, where he tells his story about how he basically taught himself to read and write and then was eventually able to escape. Now, eventually there are times when slaves turned to violent methods to revolt, and they did do this, and one of the most well-known was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. In this particular slave revolt, they are going to kill around 60 whites, but Nat Turner is caught, and he is going to be hanged. This is going to scare a lot of slaveholders in the South, because in certain locations in the South, there were more slaves than there were whites. So it's going to eventually lead to greater control over those slaves, again, linked to that fear of a slave revolt. So the ideas surrounding emancipation or the freeing of slaves were kind of two. You had one camp that said we should gradually emancipate slaves, meaning maybe, you just don't have any slaves after a certain year, so that anybody who's a slave before that year would, live the rest of their life under slavery, but not after that. So maybe, any children born would not be slaves. But then you had those who said, no, immediately, we need to end slavery right now, immediately, and not allow it to continue on. You had those who also believed that slave owners should be paid for their slaves, since it was such a large sum of money that it would have taken to purchase all of those slaves. But then you had those who believed no, that they shouldn't. So a lot of people had different reasons for being abolitionists or against slavery. Some of them religious reasons, believing that Christianity did not allow forced slavery. Others who just believed it was morally wrong to own another human being. And then others pointed to the Constitution, stating that, our Constitution states that all men are created equal. So how could we possibly own other human beings? But those who were pro-slavery really held on to those slaves. One, they were very afraid of new revolts. After Nat Turner's rebellion, now that's not the only one, but that was one of the more well-known ones. They are going to institute what are called black codes or slave codes. And these are going to be restrictions that are put on slaves that are going to not allow them to own a gun. Before this, they could, hunt if they had any free time to supplement, any kind of food that they might have. They weren't allowed to testify in court. They weren't allowed to leave their plantations without written permission from the slave owner. Again, I know this doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, they weren't allowed to know how to read and write. So it was prohibited. They were also not allowed to gather in large groups. So even, because Nat Turner was going to be a preacher, and so that was the kind of guys he used to plan his rebellion. So again, it leads to that tightening down on slaves to try to prevent another slave revolt. While you had those who were against slavery, used religious reasons to oppose slavery, there were also those who used that same religion to support it. And there were, verses in the Bible that were said, to the effect of, slaves obeying your master. And they're going to point to verses like that to support the owning of slaves. Now remember, this is significant because up until really around this time, it was still seen as slavery being a necessary evil, meaning they knew it was wrong, but felt that they had to own slaves in order to keep their economy going. By this point in time, most of those who owned slaves in the South did not see it as being morally or even that it was okay, even according to their religion. Many in the South too also purported this happy plantation slave. They said, that they cared for their slaves, even up until the day they died. Even if they could not work anymore, they were still cared for. They were still, fed and given a place to stay and sleep. And they pointed to the North and their industry and the way that those workers were just discarded and not cared for. And then after they couldn't work, they were just useless. They said, that their slaves were treated very well and like part of the family. But what you need to understand is that this is simply a myth. This was created by slave owners in the South to support what they were doing, to justify what they were doing. At the end of the day, they were still slaves. At the end of the day, were there slave owners who treated their slaves relatively well, especially in comparison to others? I'm sure there were. However, this is a myth. At the end of the day, they were still slaves, and they were owned by other people and did not have that freedom that many Americans enjoyed at this point. So again, just keep in mind that even though you have probably heard this before, that this was a myth invented by slave owners to justify what